We've all been told that 10,000 steps a day is the magic number for health. But is it? Researchers took data from dozens of different studies to find the exact step count where benefits really kick in, and it's lower than you might think. Stay with me, because the difference between 5,000, 7,000, and 10,000 really depends on what outcomes you care the most about. To really get at the question of whether you need 10,000 steps a day, a group of researchers working together from institutions like the University of Sydney, Cambridge University, University College London, among others, did what's called a meta-analysis of clinical studies on how physical activity impacts disease outcomes. I personally love reading meta-analyses. These are studies where researchers comb literature to combine information from as many different studies as they can based on criteria that they set for the analysis. This is really important because reproducibility in scientific studies tends to be very low. And meta-analyses give us a chance to have more confidence in a result because it's representing multiple studies that are done by completely independent groups, maybe over a span of years. This meta-analysis on step count was published in The Lancet, and it searched for studies that were published between 2014 and 2024 on the connection between physical activity and health outcomes. Ultimately, the authors ended up using data from 31 different studies for this analysis, so it's a pretty big sample set. In short, unsurprisingly, the authors found that getting a higher number of steps each day lowered the risk of various chronic diseases. So that included a lower risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, dementia, and depressive symptoms. The important thing, however, is that these studies together show that you don't actually need 10,000 steps a day to start getting benefit. Across all the outcomes the authors looked at, 7,000 steps a day was found to be the sweet spot, where it significantly reduced disease risk in all of the categories that they looked at, and in some cases, even 5,000 steps a day was beneficial. Just as an example, let's take a look at mortality from cardiovascular disease or heart disease. In this case, what the authors found is that as little as 5,000 steps a day was enough to reduce the risk of death due to heart disease by around 50%. By contrast, if we look at the results for dementia, the authors found that the benefits of steps per day keep increasing as you get more steps, with the strongest benefits observed at 10,000 steps per day. So in this case, more really is better. Now, there are several limitations to this meta-analysis. The studies it looked at were high quality, but they didn't all use the same methods. For example, they used different devices for measuring steps. Some used a pedometer, some used an accelerometer. So that's not entirely consistent across the studies. And from my point of view, the bigger deal is that not all the studies looked at people in the same ages, because you might expect that the impact of physical activity for someone who's age 70 is a little bit different than for someone who's age 25. In addition to that, when we consider the statistics that were used, one of the major limitations is that not every study that the authors looked at included outcomes for all of the different diseases that were analyzed. So for several of the disease outcomes, the number of appropriate studies to look at is much smaller. For example, if we consider cancer incidence and dementia, each of these was only represented by 2 different studies. Now, it's worth noting that if there's consistency across 2 or more clinical studies that are done by independent groups of individuals in different populations, that lends a lot of confidence to the result. So it's certainly much better than an individual study, but it's not as good as having, say, 5 or 10 studies that are all telling you the same thing. When you take all of this data into consideration, what I take from it is the clear message that more physical activity is better. And 10,000 steps a day is probably an ideal goal to get the most benefit possible. However, what the study tells me loud and clear is that getting 5,000 to 7,000 steps per day has huge benefits for maintaining health and wellness and preventing chronic disease. If you can't consistently get to that 10,000, it's still going to help you to get the 5,000 or 7,000. As always, references to the study that I described in this video are included in the description below. If you found this interesting, I'd encourage you to check out my last video, where I examined a study looking at a new weight loss medication that's not a GLP-1, but shows almost as much effectiveness. As always, thank you for watching and have a great day.